In what is now West Virginia, there is a 300-acre island in the middle of the Ohio River. It's called Blennerhassett Island, after Harmon Blennerhassett, the Irish gentleman who settled it. The idyllic island boasts a beautiful frontier mansion with a stable and acres of gardens. But on the night of December 10th, 1806, all is not well on the island. Top Confederates of Aaron Burr and a force of about 30 men have gathered there. They're waiting for the arrival of 11 boats purchased by Burr. 4 candle-lit boats are already bobbing in the water just off the island. They're loaded with guns, ammunition, packed meat, and other provisions. When the additional boats arrive, the 15-boat flotilla will set off down the Ohio River on a military adventure of epic proportions. Or at least that's the plan. But an agent of President Jefferson has been investigating Burr's plot. Unbeknownst to Burr's Confederates, the agent has already uncovered key details. Details about Burr's plan to create a new Western empire on the continent. In fact, the 11 boats that Burr's men are waiting for have already been seized by the Ohio militia. When word of the boat's seizure reaches the men gathered around the bonfire at Blennerhassett Island, they are shocked into action. Around midnight, they load themselves on the 4 boats, and they have to beat it down the river. The next morning, the militia reaches the island only to find it empty of plotters. Out of frustration, they wreak havoc on Blennerhassett's mansion. The militia destroys fine furniture, vases, art. They fire rifle balls through the mansion's painted ceilings and drink brandy stored in the cellar. Now, what happened at Blennerhassett Island that December night will become the central focus of the treason trial of Aaron Burr. Witnesses will describe the events of that night. Some of the nation's best lawyers will debate whether what happened on that island supports a charge of treason. And none other than John Marshall, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, but also a trial judge in the Burr case, will rule on the matter and effectively decide Burr's fate. The trial of Aaron Burr is a complicated political trial with disputed facts. To begin to understand it, we have to go back a couple of years, to 1804. It was an unstable time. With the Louisiana Purchase the previous year, the United States gained vast new territory stretching westward from the Mississippi River. The new territory included the important port city of New Orleans. But Spain still had control of present-day Texas, Mexico, Florida, and what is now the American Southwest. Given the competing interests of long-standing European empire on the one hand, and a young republic on the other, tensions were running high. In fact, the United States and Spain seemed to be on the verge of war. Boundaries were in dispute. Spain had prohibited residents from the new Louisiana Territory from entering its lands. It had troops stationed along the Sabine River to protect the Spanish frontier from invasion by U.S. citizens. Now, most Americans saw Spain as tyrannical. They viewed Texas and Florida as rightful parts of the United States. Many citizens of the Louisiana Territory wanted to take the Spanish territory by force. Jefferson administration, however, was in no mood for a war with Spain. And since Spain and France were presently allied in a war against Great Britain, Jefferson was determined to maintain a policy of neutrality. He intended to enforce the Neutrality Act of 1794, which made it a crime for any citizen to undertake a military expedition against any country with which the United States was at peace. Meanwhile, while still the sitting Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr ran for governor of New York and lost. During the campaign, Alexander Hamilton called Burr despicable and dangerous, someone who would dismember the Union if given the chance. Outraged, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. We all know what happened. The bullet that killed Hamilton on that cliff in Weehawken, New Jersey, ended any chance Burr might have had of achieving his political goals in the East. His thoughts turned to the West. Burr imagined a new empire in the Southwest, with himself as emperor. He would lead a military expedition into Texas and Mexico, and once there, the local population, resentful of Spanish control, would welcome him with open arms. Or so he thought. Burr started a series of conversations really, with people who he thought could aid in his military adventure. He met with General James Wilkinson, the top general in the United States Army. Burr knew Wilkinson was sympathetic to the idea of Western expansion. And he also met with Anthony Merry, the British minister to the United States. Burr made a most unusual offer to Merry, which the minister reported in a dispatch to London labeled top secret. Merry wrote, quote, "I have just received an offer from Mr. Burr, the actual Vice President of the United States, to lend his assistance to His Majesty's government in any manner they may think fit to employ him, particularly in endeavoring to effect a separation of the western part of the United States from that which lies between the Atlantic and the Appalachian Mountains." By the spring of 1805, Burr had resigned the vice presidency. He moved full bore ahead with his plan for conquest and adventure. Heading west, Burr stopped in Pittsburgh, where he hoped to find General Wilkinson, who by then was the new governor of the just organized Louisiana Territory. But Wilkinson was not there. So Burr left a letter for the general and set off down the Ohio River. The river carried travelers into the heart of the West. He traveled in a 60-foot-long boat, complete with a dining room, kitchen, fireplace, and 2 bedrooms. Burr called it his Ark. In early May, Burr's Ark reached Blennerhassett Island, where the island's owner invited him to dinner. The conversation between the two men lasted long into the evening. The precise nature of the plans they discussed is not known, but some inkling of its substance may be gleaned from a letter Blennerhassett sent later that year to Burr. "I should be honored in being associated with you in any contemplated enterprise you would permit me to participate in. Viewing the probability of a rupture with Spain, I am disposed, in the confidential spirit of this letter, to offer you my friends and my own services in any contemplated measures in which you may embark." Continuing down the Ohio River, Burr caught up with General Wilkinson at Fort Massac in what would become Illinois. The two discussed strategy for their possible military action in Louisiana. Wilkinson provided Burr with a letter of introduction to his friends in New Orleans, which was Burr's ultimate destination. When he arrived in New Orleans, a city Burr loved, he set out to gauge public opinion about Mexico. He also talked with people about business opportunities that a Mexican insurrection might open up. Burr left New Orleans in late July of 1805 on a 4-month tour that included another meeting with General Wilkinson in St. Louis. Now, what happened at this meeting comes only from Wilkinson's later written and probably self-serving report. According to Wilkinson, it was during this meeting that he first began to suspect that Burr had treasonous intentions. Burr's plan, he concluded, was not just to spark an insurrection in Mexico, it was also to create a new Western empire. Wilkinson quoted Burr as complaining about the imbecility of the government and saying that the people of the Western country were ready for revolt. Now, back east, in the winter of 1805-1806, Burr met with various disaffected military leaders, and he urged them to join in his adventure. In summer, Burr, with his daughter Theodosia and her young child, headed to the west once again. In western Pennsylvania, they hoped to enlist the support of the influential Colonel George Morgan. But Burr made a serious mistake of misgauging Morgan's interest in his plans. His host found Burr's notion of using military force to carve out a new Western nation shocking. So shocking that Morgan wrote a letter to President Jefferson summarizing his conversation with Burr. The letter roused Jefferson into action. By the end of August, Burr was back on Blennerhassett Island, busying himself with final preparations. He contracted to purchase 15 boats capable of carrying 500 men. He ordered huge quantities of pork, cornmeal, flour, whiskey. Burr also bought a 300,000-acre tract of land on the Washita River, which he planned to use as a recruiting tool. Volunteers for the expedition, Burr promised, would each get a share of his tract. In the fall, Burr wrote a letter in cipher to General Wilkinson. "I have at length obtained funds," the coded letter began, "and have actually commenced." Burr revealed that he had secured naval protection from England and was heading west, never to return. He assured Wilkinson of success. "I guarantee the result with my life and honor, the honor and fortune of hundreds, the best blood of our country. The gods invite us to glory and fortune." Meanwhile, the agent appointed by Jefferson to investigate the Burr plot had swung into action. In the capital of Chillicothe, the capital of Ohio, he convinced the governor to order out the militia to seize the boats that Burr had ordered for his expedition. This was the militia that would descend on Blennerhassett Island. Meanwhile, Burr was in Tennessee when he learned his boats had been seized and that Jefferson was on to his plot. He hurriedly set off down the Cumberland River. At the falls of the Ohio River, Burr met up with his recruits. He told them that he had hoped to be able to describe their specific objective, but because of changed circumstances, he would have to postpone doing so. Instead, he said, the flotilla would head down the Mississippi, where Burr expected military backing. But the military support that Burr expected was to come from General Wilkinson, and General Wilkinson had become his hunter, not his supporter. After receiving the ciphered letter from Burr advising of his plans, Wilkinson rushed troops into the Mississippi Valley. He ordered troops in New Orleans to be on the alert for an attack from Burr's forces. President Jefferson, meanwhile, signed a proclamation stating that, quote, "Sundry persons are conspiring to set on foot a military expedition against the dominions of Spain." The president ordered all military and other government officials to assist in searching out and bringing to punishment all persons engaged or concerned in such enterprise. 30 miles above Natchez on the Mississippi, Burr finally learned that Wilkinson had abandoned the conspiracy. He was beside himself. He complained that the general's perfidious conduct had completely frustrated his projects. Burr recognized that it was time to begin putting an innocent spin on his actions. And so he wrote the public a letter, declaring his intentions to be honorable. "If the alarm which has been excited should not be appeased by this declaration, I invite my fellow citizens to visit me at this place and to receive from me in person such further explanations as may be necessary to their satisfaction." A U.S. military detachment of 30 men caught up with Burr when he and his expedition of about 80 men were camped across from Natchez on the west bank of the Mississippi. Burr was handed a letter from the governor of the Mississippi Territory. The letter demanded his surrender. Burr was headed to trial, but that wouldn't come easy. 2 different Western grand juries refused to indict him. One grand jury went so far as to condemn his arrest, saying that it had given cause to the enemies of our glorious Constitution to rejoice. Burr jumped bail, disguised himself as a boatman, and then disappeared into the wild pine forests on the east side of the Mississippi. Federal marshals captured Burr on the Tombigbee River in present-day Alabama. The Jefferson administration knew that their best shot at getting an indictment of Burr was in the Republican stronghold of Virginia. And if you're thinking these multiple attempts to indict Burr seem irregular and politically motivated, you're right. Getting Burr to court in Richmond was also a slog. It required a 1,000-mile horseback trip through heavy rains, dense forest, and Indian country. On March 30th, 1807, in the small room in the Eagle Tavern in Richmond, Virginia, John Marshall prepared to hear arguments on whether to commit Burr for trial on the capital charge of treason. Marshall also happened to be, of course, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Justices did double duty as trial judges in those days. It is worth noting that John Marshall, the Federalist judge, and Thomas Jefferson, the Republican president, hated each other. Representing the United States was District Attorney George Hay, the son-in-law of future President James Monroe. The real force behind the prosecution, however, was President Thomas Jefferson. A word here about the charge of treason. Under our Constitution, it is not treason to think about waging war against the United States, nor is it treason to discuss with others plans for waging war against the United States. What is necessary is to actually have levied war in some sense, to have committed an overt act of war. So had Aaron Burr committed such an overt act, it was on that question, and on that question alone, that the prosecution of Aaron Burr would rise or fall. Could it be proven that Burr took actions that amounted to levying war? And that question brings us back to what happened at Blennerhassett Island. Because John Marshall was not convinced there was sufficient evidence of an overt act, he dismissed the treason charge. Marshall wrote, quote, "War can only be levied by the employment of actual force. An invisible army is not an instrument of war." The Chief Justice went out of his way to criticize Jefferson. He wrote, "The hand of malignity cannot capriciously seize a man and charge him with some secret crime." Marshall concluded, however, that there was probable cause to commit Burr for trial on violation of the Neutrality Act. Now, Marshall's refusal to allow the prosecution on the treason charge enraged Jefferson. The president suspected that the Chief Justice's judgment was warped in favor of Burr by his own dislike of the administration. Jefferson took it as his personal mission to secure Burr's conviction. He asked, "Is there a candid man in the United States who does not believe that some one, if not all, of these overt acts have taken place?" Throughout the pretrial and trial period, letters flew back and forth between Jefferson and District Attorney Hay. The president, more so than the district attorney, managed the prosecution. Jefferson ordered that circulars be distributed throughout the Western country, asking, quote, "every good citizen to step forward and communicate to the government any information he may possess." He dispatched the Deputy Marshal to take depositions near Blennerhassett Island. Never before or since has a president of the United States taken such a personal interest in a criminal case. Now, Jefferson's view of Burr's actions was revealed in his letters. Jefferson wrote that he thought Burr intended to seize the city of New Orleans, placing him at the door of Mexico. Then the president wrote, Burr planned to separate the western states from us, add Mexico to them, and place himself at their head. Burr's conspiracy was called by Jefferson one of the most villainous in all of history. Despite Marshall's ruling, Jefferson and the prosecution hoped that a grand jury indictment for treason might put the charge back on the table. The prosecution presented the grand jury with a parade of witnesses against Burr. The witnesses included Andrew Jackson, for example, who once was counted among Burr's supporters. But the witness everyone was waiting to hear, General James Wilkinson, was still making his way from New Orleans to Virginia, his exact whereabouts unknown. While the grand jury twiddled its thumbs, John Marshall considered various prosecution and defense motions. One of the most significant decisions the Chief Justice made was whether to grant the defense's motion for a subpoena to be directed to the president. The requested subpoena would require President Jefferson to turn over letters he had received from General Wilkinson that might be helpful to the defense. Burr's attorney, Luther Martin, argued, "The president has undertaken to prejudge my client by declaring of his guilt there can be no doubt. He has proclaimed him a traitor. He has let slip the dogs of war, the hellhounds of prosecution, to hunt down my friend. And would this president of the United States, who has raised all this absurd clamor, pretend to keep back the papers which are wanted for this trial? where life itself is at stake? It is a sacred principle that in all such cases, the accused has the right to all the evidence which is necessary for his case. Well, arguments went on for days, but in the end, Marshall ruled that the subpoena to the president could issue. In the words of Marshall, the propriety of introducing any paper into a case must depend on the character of the paper, not the character of the person who holds it. Marshall's decision, by the way, to this day remains an important precedent. No man in this country is above the law. Jefferson, however, never turned over the requested letters, and Marshall had no alternative but to let the matter drop. The president stated his position in a letter to one of the prosecutors. The leading feature of our Constitution is the independence of the legislative, executive, and the judiciary from each other. But would the executive be independent of the judiciary if he were subject to the commands of the latter and to imprisonment for disobedience? If the smaller courts could bandy him from pillar to post, keeping him constantly trudging from north to south and east to west, and withdraw him entirely from his executive duties? It's basically the same argument that the lawyers for President Clinton made in their effort to fend off Paula Jones's sexual harassment lawsuit, that a president can't be bothered with such things. The Supreme Court opinion roundly rejected Clinton's argument. The court said, quote, "It unequivocally and emphatically endorsed Marshall's position in the Burr trial." On June 15th, General Wilkinson, who the defense described as the alpha and omega of the present prosecution, finally arrived in Richmond to appear before the grand jury. Burr and his defense team now saw Wilkinson as a despot and a tyrant, the dictator of New Orleans, a man not above, for example, breaking into a post office to look for communications that might incriminate Burr. Wilkinson's dramatic testimony convinced the grand jury to report an indictment against Burr for treason as well as high misdemeanor. Burr pleaded not guilty. The hall of the Virginia House of Delegates was filled to capacity for the opening of the prosecution case on August 3, 1807. Burr came to trial with certain advantages. He had good lawyers, not the least of whom was himself the leader of his own defense. He also had a favorable judge. Then, of course, were his constitutional protections, the presumption of innocence, the requirement of guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In his opening statement, District Attorney Hay told the jury of 12 men that the evidence would show that Burr had a treasonable design. Hay said that what happened on Blennerhassett Island amounted to an overt act. Men were actually enlisted, boats were built on the waters of Ohio, provisions purchased to an enormous amount, and ammunition provided, as if some hostile expedition were afoot. Prosecutors laid out what they saw as Burr's grand scheme of Western conquest through their first few witnesses. General William Eaton testified that Burr revealed to him his plan to create a Western empire with New Orleans as its capital and with him as its chief. Then prosecutors turned their attention to what happened on Blennerhassett Island. The island's gardener, Peter Taylor, described for the jury a conversation he had had with Harmon Blennerhassett. He said, "I will tell you what, Peter, we are going to take Mexico, one of the finest and richest places in the whole world." He said that Colonel Burr would be the king of Mexico and that Burr's daughter was to be the queen of Mexico whenever Colonel Burr died. Taylor told the jury about the military preparations that had taken place on the island. The prosecutor asked, "Were there any guns?" "Some of them had," answered Taylor, "but I don't know how many there were." On cross-examination, defense lawyers sought to make it clear to jurors that on the night in question, Burr was nowhere near the island. Was Colonel Burr there? "No, I did not see him. I never saw him on the island." Another witness testified that he saw between 20 and 25 men on the island that night, as well as rifles and pistols. He added that there were 3 or 4 fuses put on a boat. On August 20th, Burr asked the court to halt the prosecution's testimony. Burr argued that the evidence utterly failed to prove any overt act of war had been committed. Moreover, he said, the testimony proved him to have been over 100 miles away when the alleged overt act took place. 11 days of argument on Burr's motion followed. For the government, William Wirt argued that Burr was to everyone else in the conspiracy as the sun to the planets that surround it. Did he not bind them in their respective orbits and give them their light, their heat, and their motion? The prosecutor described Burr as holding a match and ready to produce an explosion to shake the continent. It was all to begin on that idyllic island. In the words of Wirt, Blennerhassett was Eden and Burr was the serpent, ready to infuse into it the poison of his own ambitions. Chief Justice Marshall praised the lawyers on both sides. He told them they argued their cases with, quote, a degree of eloquence seldom displayed on any occasion. Marshall's ruling punched a huge hole in the prosecution's case. Marshall decided that as a matter of law, Burr could not be found to have committed treason based on the events at that island. To be guilty, there would have had to have been actual use of force, and Burr would have had to have been connected to that use of force. And with those words, the game was effectively won for Burr. John Marshall had demanded that the prosecution show what it could not show. The government had little choice but to rest its case. The jury found Burr not guilty. Nevertheless, jurors hinted that they might have decided the case differently, but for John Marshall's instructions. We of the jury say that Aaron Burr is not proved to be guilty under the indictment by any evidence submitted to us. Marshall's narrow view of what might be an overt act had left the jury no choice. A few weeks later, the jury acquitted Burr on the neutrality charge as well. Aaron Burr was a free man. Or almost free. John Marshall conceded that the prosecution had a point. Down rivers farther west, Burr had traveled with his men, their weapons, and their ammunition. The very soul of the expedition, as the prosecutor put it. Even if Burr could not be tried and convicted in Virginia for what happened there, perhaps he could in a Western court. Marshall ordered Burr to report to Chillicothe, Ohio, to defend himself one more time on another charge of violating the Neutrality Act. Burr posted bail, then fled north, not west. He had no intention of ever seeing the inside of a courtroom again. President Jefferson fumed over Marshall's ruling. It now appears we have no law but the will of the judge. He considered proposing a constitutional amendment, limiting the power of the judiciary. He even considered asking Congress to impeach the Chief Justice. In a letter to General Wilkinson, Jefferson expressed his frustration. The scenes which have been acted at Richmond are such as have never been exhibited in any country, where all regard to public character has not yet been thrown off. They are equivalent to a proclamation of impunity to every traitorous combination which may be formed to destroy the Union. Burr, despite his acquittal, was disgraced. Although he lived another 29 years, he never again was a significant player in American public life. As an old man, Burr heard news of the Texas Revolution. He excitedly told a friend, "There, you see, I was right." I was only 30 years too soon. What was treason 30 years ago is patriotism now. Even today, it is hard to say whether Aaron Burr was guilty of treason. As Burr biographer Buckner Melton notes, too many people told too many different stories, and too many people had things to hide. But Burr's trial did answer important questions and raised yet others. John Marshall set the precedent that in the United States, no man, even the president, is above the law. However, Marshall put his great weight on the side of a narrow interpretation of criminal statutes. Even the devil deserves the benefit of law, or freedom for all is at risk. The trial also raises a great question. In trials like this, can politics and justice ever be kept entirely separate? Jefferson's meddling, in the end, probably hurt Burr's prosecution more than it helped. Don't mess with a smart and wily judge.